call it my 4 C's: character, commitment, competence, and candor. And I talked to them about that, about why those are important.
Welcome to the Disgruntled PM podcast, your weekly therapy session for the chaotic world of project management, transforming daily frustrations into real action. Welcome, everybody. I'm Trevor, the Disgruntled PM, joined today by my special guest, General Bryan Grenon.
Hey,
Now,
Trevor.
now, Bryan has quite the diverse background in a lot of different industries, and I wanted to bring him on because how often do you get to talk to a real general? And so, Bryan, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. As Trevor mentioned, I'm Bryan Grenon. I'm Brigadier General retired, uh, but I do have quite a diverse background, and I think that maybe later in the episode we'll be able to talk about how Trevor and I crossed paths.
All right. So we can get started with addressing the general part in the room right now because you actually were approved for more than one star, correct?
Yeah, I was. So the way the National Guard works, and I'm retired from the National Guard, uh, you get uh, you get submitted in to the Senate, and then the Senate will confirm you. So I was confirmed by the Senate for 2 stars, but my time ran out before I was selected for a 2 star position.
Okay. So I just want everyone to know that this is not just your one-star general, that he actually was approved for a second star. And you mentioned something about you were in the National Guard, and for the audience that doesn't know the military, can you kind of explain what the difference between the active duty component that everybody knows and what the National Guard does?
Sure. So the National Guard is, historically it's been built up about what they call citizen soldiers or part-time soldiers. And I'm sure that that was probably true 30 years ago. But nowadays, in the National Guard, whether that's the Army National Guard, whether it's the Air Force National Guard, or whatever reserve component, uh there's no longer that delineation where you have 1 weekend a month and 2 weekends a year. The operational tempo of the environment that we're in now is of such that our reserve components, the National Guard and other components, are just constantly being called up, uh put on missions across the globe. And so it is a different environment. But yeah, it's the premise is that you work you have a civilian career, and then you are a part-time soldier. And then so my civilian career, I was a law enforcement officer. I spent 30 years with the Seattle Police Department. I retired about 4 years ago as an assistant chief of the Seattle Police Department.
Now, I want to highlight a couple of things that Bryan didn't. The National Guard, unlike the reserves, is run by the state government. So that means that Bryan was living in Washington State. So that meant that he was part of the Washington National Guard, which meant the state governor controlled how they use those resources rather than the federal government at the national level.
Yeah,
Correct?
yeah, yeah. No, you're probably about 90% true. So in the National Guard, as opposed to say the Army Reserve, you actually serve two masters. You have the state commander in chief, which is the governor, but then you also have your federal mission for what you train for. So by trade, I was an artilleryman. So I commanded an artillery battalion. I also commanded a striker brigade. And so we got our funding through the Department of Defense and our training dollars to train for that federal mission to fight and win the nation's wars when called upon. But then, in times of national disaster, or you know, just things that spiral out of control, that the state needs resources, the governor has access and commands and control the National Guard.
Yeah, and I want to let the audience know I'm drawing these distinct lines and giving this background because it's going to become crucial as we talk more with Bryan about his career, because both being in local law enforcement and also being higher ranking in the state militia, so to speak. He literally served two masters, and with a lot of civil unrest that would happen and different events that happened in the state, you were literally wearing two hats at once a lot of times,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So going into that, you have you have two remarkable careers that you've already finished, operating at very high levels in distinct worlds of civilian law enforcement and the military, and now you work in corporate security. When you look back, what's kind of one common thread or core skill that you can say helped you along the way with excelling in all these places?
Well, I think, I mean, if you put your finger on it, it's really about um, the embedded, competence, I guess, that you get from serving in the military. Um, the discipline, the attention to detail, the desire to perform and exceed expectations. I think those transcend both law enforcement and in the military, and they go hand in hand. One helps the other. As I grew my military career in the National Guard, I learned skills and abilities that translated directly over into the law enforcement side, and vice versa. Dealing with the public, the uncertainties of law enforcement, I think that helped me in my military career because the things that perhaps may have caused anxiety or flustered me, in those challenging situations in the military, you dealt with them on a daily basis in law enforcement, and you were able to adapt more quickly. So I think both of those kind of strengthened each other.
And when you think about I'm going to focus right now on those two careers of law enforcement and military. You started in law enforcement, which is kind of the equivalent of being enlisted in the military, where you start as a patrolman and then work your way up. In the military, you were a commissioned officer, so you started as a lieutenant. Can you kind of talk through how those were different in terms of leadership roles and how you grew into them throughout your career?
Yeah, yeah. So in the military, obviously, if you start off as an officer, you're thrust into a leadership role. Now, albeit, a second lieutenant, uh, in the military, we try not to give them too much responsibility just because they're learning, but you are a leader. You're a leader from the start. And in law enforcement, you start off as a police officer, patrolman, and you work for a sergeant, and you're really focused on your individual tasks, those tasks that are assigned to you, and then you grow into that, from that experience, and then I mean, everybody starts at the bottom in law enforcement, and then you work your way up, and in the military, you'll start off at the baseline second lieutenant, which is you know, inexperienced, young officer with, not much knowledge except for the training that they had, and then you grow into those roles. So there are distinct differences as far as where you start, but you're still at the bottom on both of those.
Yeah, and I would kind of say that being a patrolman is a lot like being is analogous in a project management role where you're having to deal with situations and lead through influence rather than authority, because most people, when they see a patrolman, for better or worse, we don't exactly look at them and they command respect.
Yeah.
So how would you go about a situation when you would go on site to a crime scene or something where you had to do crowd control or interact with the public and kind of work with gaining some trust and gaining some authority with influence rather than position?
Well, yeah, and I think that's a yeah, I think that's a great topic to bring up because so when you start off in law enforcement, I think many come with a mentality that I've got this uniform, and now I automatically have this. authority, and you're going to do what I tell you to do, and that's not necessarily the case. You're granted by law, a certain amount of authority to accomplish your job, but 90% of police work is really about influence. It's really about gaining trust with the people that you're working with, whether that's a crime victim, or whether that's a suspect that you want to go in and arrest. Because I can guarantee you, it is much easier to arrest that person if they they feel like that you're somebody that's going to treat them reasonably and with respect, than it is to go in and just say you can do what I do because I'm Johnny Law and I've got a uniform on. Automatically when you're wearing that uniform, you've got a certain amount of presence, that has that authority. But it really doesn't convince many people to do what you need them to do. It's much easier to talk somebody into handcuffs than it is to get into a fight and get injured yourself, injure the person, and cause problems within the community.
Yeah, and that's a lot like the same scenario we dealt with overseas in the military too, where you don't have a badge, but you've got a uniform and a weapon, and you're going around to different indigenous people's locations, and you've got to lead through influence rather than authority because there's only so much you can get out of somebody by pointing a weapon in their face
Yeah,
or in their
exactly.
chest or in their general direction.
Yeah, it only goes
And
so far until they get tired of it. Right.
and that can end up with you on the other side of the law in a lot of cases too, because there are rules about that too.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a great segue because I think in law enforcement, when you're a patrol officer, we all knew those officers that no matter what, just their personality always seemed to, it's like that person is, you know, person's guaranteed to have some problems, and we're going to end up having to bail them out because of their mouth, because of their attitude, where as opposed to those other officers that can go into a situation, calm people, gain some respect, and still accomplish what you need to do. I mean, there are times when you absolutely have to make an arrest, and that person is not going to like it. There's people that, automatically that there's going to be a fight, and then there's people that can calm the situation and be able to push that person under arrest without a fight, and making it safer for everybody.
Yeah, and I want to make it clear to the audience that I am a supporter of law enforcement for police officers that do the right thing. And we are not going to go into a political topic of law enforcement or any of the hot button type of things now. But as somebody who served in law enforcement and saw a lot of different shifts in the public, can you kind of talk about how you had to react to the public as they changed their sentiments towards law enforcement and adapt your approach, which goes back to that whole leading through influence rather than authority?
Yeah, well, I think, in some respects, I think, I was a little more conditioned to it because, so I worked for Seattle Police Department, and there is I would say that, as opposed to other areas of the country, other cities, there's um, it just seems like by the nature, there's a larger mistrust of law enforcement too. It always seemed like it was harder for us to be able to gain, um, you know, uh, a mutual understanding and a shared respect. And I would say it wasn't impossible, but I will tell you that there was a monumental shift right after, in 2020, I believe, when the murder of George Floyd, in Minneapolis, that caused a just a fundamental shift. And at that time, I was a precinct commander, and, I mean, spending tremendous amount of my own personal time, well, not my personal time, but I gave a lot of time having community meetings and, just trying to work with the community to develop a better, relationship, between law enforcement and between the community, which, had a certain amount of mistrust to begin with. Uh, but there was a fundamental shift, and even those, average citizens that at that time were supporters, it just like overnight, everybody, and I think that was the collective consciousness. You saw everything on TV, everywhere. It was a like a fundamental shift against law enforcement, and that was extremely challenging. To get inroads anywhere for us, it was challenging. And I will say that the momentum is shifting backwards. People are still, rightfully want to hold police to a standard, but I don't think that they're automatically hold as much animus as they did at that time during that 2 or 3 year window.
So I want to kind of go back to something you just mentioned about when there was all the civil unrest in 2020. There was a lot of unrest in Seattle area and Washington state. And I know you were high ranking in the National Guard, so you had to activate the National Guard. The governor activated the National Guard to help augment the police department. And then you also had a precinct that you were in charge of. Can you kind of talk about how you handled the crisis management of literally two entirely different mechanisms of trying to quell the unrest without using overwhelming force?
Yeah, well, I will tell you just a crisis management side of the house. So just to kind of set the stage. So I was, I'd already been promoted to Brigadier General. And this was in the high point of the COVID time period, so everything was shut down. People weren't at work. So I got activated to the Secretary of Defense at that time had me serve as a dual status commander because at the time they were going to put in a very large military hospital in one of the arenas in Seattle, and so with federal resources, and so that I was activated to be that bridge between the state and the active duty units to manage that, for the state. So I'd been on orders for about 3 months or so when the George Floyd situation happened, and then all hell broke loose in the city of Seattle, and cities across the nation. Very very uh, violent type of rioting. Cars burning, stores being broken into. And at that point, I just said, I got to go back to work. I think we're in a good situation here in the National Guard, so I went back to work, and then immediately, that's when the protesting began to ramp up, exponentially. So I immediately went into that and tried to manage the situation. But what happened was is that we just got overwhelmed as a police department. So, I was a precinct commander, but I got called up to run our police operations center, Seattle Police Operations Center, which is basically, the main focal point for all the information that's coming in, and then, executing uh, operational orders, for the department. It was a challenge. We as an organization, the law enforcement organization, just wasn't ready for that. We had, for most of our history, we had dealt with big events, but they were short in duration and limited in scope. But this was a full activation of every member of the police department. This was 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day. This was managing, large protests that had bad actors that were embedded into it. So it was very challenging. So one of the biggest challenges that I had is that there was no process that was set up to be able to manage that. Uh, and very quickly, using the skills that I had learned, from the military, it was to come up with a operational plan for us to do that. So I think you probably know this, Trevor. In an operations center in the military, you have your current operations that's running the battle, and then you have future operations that's looking to the future. And we had no real ability to be able to do that. So I established that. Uh, but there was a lot of disarray, meaning what do we do next? Um, from a leadership perspective, it was really about, developing a plan, um,
So it's one of those things where, we talk about crisis and emergencies, and you're literally just putting band-aids on gushing wounds, trying to stop the whack-a-mole from getting out of control.
that's exactly it. But even more so, it's about how do we manage this for the future? Because, you only have a finite amount of resources, and if you expend it all, what do you do 2 days from now, 3 days from now? And so you have to have this plan, to be able to, make this continue for who knows how long. And that was part of it is let's come up with a plan. A 70% plan is better than a perfect plan that's too late. And that was really
Yeah.
about it. Have a plan, communicate that plan, and be able to, drive forward.
Yeah, and when we're talking about crisis management, I I don't use these terms very often because in my previous life in the military, crisis management means something totally different than what it does for 90% of the civilian population. And when you're in law enforcement and you're dancing around the military too, can you kind of talk about how you managed crisis or how you did crisis management and kind of triaged priorities because you dealt with putting aside that whole unrest situation, you oversaw Seattle Seahawks games, Seattle Kraken games, different sporting events, you know, everyday things that we take for granted are safe, but you're looking at that as something totally different and not safe because you're trying to keep everyone safe.
Right, right. Well, I think, there's kind of two distinct differences there, so for the known events, you can plan for those and you can come up with a very robust plan because again that it's a short duration, it's finite, and you can coordinate. The more challenging pieces are those no notice, events that happen, that stretch you very thin, and have a significant risk of things falling apart. Somebody gets hurt, property gets damaged, you know,
Like
those
a
kind of
local
things like
team, like a local team winning a championship.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, I think it's ubiquitous now, but I mean, one of your teams that win a Super Bowl or
Yep.
the NBA championship or the National Hockey League championship, you know that there's going to be a mass gathering of people, and within that, there's going to be a group of people that are going to do stupid things, and you have to put together a plan pretty quickly, to be able to mitigate that and keep people safe.
And you're talking about going into the unknowns. You don't necessarily know where that gathering is going to come up until it
Exactly.
starts happening because you know, you could be monitoring the city and seeing three precincts, things look okay. It could be in any one of those three. And then all of a sudden it pops up in a fourth place that you weren't even eyeing. And all of a sudden just chaos happens,
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly.
So it, when we talk about crisis management, I've had another law enforcement person on the show, and we talked about how an investigation is like a project. And one of the things he brought up was when he goes to an accident scene and it shuts down a lane of traffic, his focus is how do I get the public back on the road? How do I clear this? How do I make this the least impactful way that I can? And as civilians, we don't always think that way because we're sitting there stuck in traffic.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, within that, I mean, you also have to do those things that, for investigative purposes, so
yep.
especially if, like a major injury or, a death, they have to get all those measurements. They have to do all those things because, this is a potential criminal prosecution down the road or civil case down the road. And they got to get all that information. And you only have, short period of time before all that evidence is destroyed. So yeah, yeah, those
Yeah.
are
And once you get on the scene, there's a finite amount of time to be able to go through all of your checklists, all your processes. And, you know, I'm going to equate this to project management, but not in the literal sense. But, you wake up in the middle of the night, you go into a crisis center of software is down or something's not working. You're not at your best already. And then you're expected to perform like that on the spot. You know, we, we got to give a little bit of grace to everybody involved in these scenarios of crisis management and not just think, well, you're here. Why aren't you performing at your best?
right, right, right.
You know, because it could be you're at the tail end of a 12-hour shift and now you're stuck at a crime scene for 3 hours. So now you're on a 15-hour shift. Oh, and by the way, your next shift is still 9 hours away now.
Well, it seems like that's always a given in law enforcement, right when you're ready to go home is when the most complex, challenging thing hits, and you're stuck with that for the next, 10 or 12 hours because, you're the one that's the primary responsible person for that, so it's just it never happens at the beginning of your shift. It always seems to happen at the end.
So would a good note be to, if you're going to be speeding, make sure you know when shift change is so you can speed towards the end of shift change, not at the beginning.
Yeah.
So now let's move on from that to some of the events that you were responsible for. You had to coordinate lots of different stakeholders with competing interests. You had police, you had federal agencies, private security, local city officials, private businesses. You know, you're trying to wrangle all these different competing interests, and your interest is, how do I make this safe while everybody else is screaming at you about their priorities? How'd you kind of juggle that when you're doing these events and overseeing this stuff?
Yeah, it's really about just trying to stay focused on what needs to be done, because you're absolutely right. And from a law enforcement perspective, or at least from my experience, you have a whole lot of stakeholders. Not much different than it would be like say in the business world, but you have the community, which is ultimately you know who you're ultimately responsible for, but you have, your local government, right? Your mayor, your city council, those other entities. We were dealing with the emergency management side, because they're the ones that deal, with procurement and those kind of things like that. We had the officers, because they were being pulled in a whole bunch of different ways, and they're very tired and hungry, and then you had leadership side of the house. So I had a police chief that I had to work with, and then you also had other entities within the city. Fire department and public works and all those other things, so there was a whole bunch of different groups that got together to try and manage this. And it was really about, how do you prioritize this and making sure that we're accomplishing what we need to do for today. And then we'll look at tomorrow. But what is it that we need to get done? What is the number one priority? And we'll start moving forward with that, because you do have competing interests, right? So for especially in that snapshot in time, law enforcement wasn't at the highest priority, and there wasn't, I mean, it was a negative perception because of what happened. And trying to get resources, trying to get cooperation was a challenge. But ultimately we were able to do that. But it was really about figuring out how do we accomplish that, and prioritizing what was important, and making those steps first. We'll get this, we'll get that, we'll get that, and we'll get that, and then we'll have a plan, and then we're ready to go.
Well, let's take that example to something that everyone can understand, like the football games or the hockey games that you had to coordinate for. You're coordinating not just the law enforcement side, but you're also looking at what does the venue have to prioritize? Because they want to make sure everybody gets in quickly, but you're concerned about, are they bringing weapons in? Are they safe in the arena? Are we filling it to capacity? Is there proper EMS on site? And the arena staff are just like, well, we want to drop the puck at this time.
Right. Right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think some of that is about relationships. Enduring relationships that you have with the venue, the point of contacts that you have. On the Seahawks side, they had a, security officer that we dealt with, the security director, that was very competent, very sharp. You're right. There's a whole bunch of different, competing interests. It's really about getting the fans into the stadium in a timely manner because, fans want to get in. They don't want to wait, 3 hours or 2 hours, to get wanded and, gate checked and all those other things like that in order to get in. So it's about throughput for that, making sure that everybody was safe. Um, but it's also about, having that, sort of that, um, common operating picture about what was going on, right? So working with all the cameras in the stadium to understand what's happening at any point in time, knowing where your resources were at to be able to respond to that, both inside and outside the stadium and the external threats. Nowadays, for specifically football, you've got the drone threat. You never know
Yeah.
what's going to happen. And those are areas and concerns that you have to worry about too, because that drone operator could be 5 miles out, so working with the FAA, working with the other elements, tracking devices, those kind of things like that, be able to find and co-locate and send your officers to that location, so there's all kinds of competing efforts there, but yeah, there's a lot
Yeah. And
going on.
then, and then you talking about, and then we haven't even touched on the cybersecurity side of everything,
Mhm.
because cybersecurity is one of those things that you can't arrest.
Right, right, right. And it's
You've got to backtrack it and find where it came from. And by that time, if you're good, the person's already gone.
yeah, and it's pretty insidious because those kind of things where they may be there for years, until they want to pull the trigger.
Yeah. So, I mean, it really is interesting. And I'll kind of wrap this portion of the interview up with, over the course of your 30 years in law enforcement and military, what's kind of one or two things that you learned that helped you the most when you went into the private sector working for different organizations?
Um, well, where I think that helped me, and it helps me to this day. One of the things that I learned specifically in the military, and it helps translate is that, and I'll set this in context. One of my roles, I was what they call a dual hat position. So not only was I a general officer in the state of Washington, but I also had a role in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. I was the deputy commanding general for the Fire Center of Excellence for the National Guard side of the house, and that's a major training base. So, talk about officers, enlisted soldiers, NCOs, warrant officers. It was a major training hub. And one of the things that, I had to think about this, I had like a snapshot. I had like 2 or 3 minutes before, in front of each of these groups to talk to them, not only to see how they're doing, but also to kind of impart some kind of general knowledge. And so I distilled kind of what I've
I see
learned.
what you did there.
So I distilled through what I've learned into sort of a four piece kind of elevator pitch, and I call it my 4 C's: character, commitment, competence, and candor. And I talk to them about that, about why those are important. If you want to succeed in the military, whether you're an officer, whether you're enlisted, whether you're a warrant officer, whether you're an NCO, These are the four things that I are critically important, and it's also in the civilian side of the house, in different aspects, but it's important. You have to be of high moral character, right? You have to live life with high, ethical standards, commitment. You have to have that desire, that burning urge to be able to, to be committed to whatever organization it is, because nobody wants half-hearted people working for them, right? Competence, learn your you learn your trade, learn your skills, and learn those about around you. And candor, it's really about speaking truth to power, right? As a senior leader in the military, uh, I hated when people were afraid to be able to speak your mind, right? When you're dealing with half information, you want people to be able to tell you the truth. Hey, sir, that plan that you were talking about, it's not going to work because of this. Well, that's information that I want to know, and I don't want people to be afraid to be able to provide that information. So be able to provide and speak your truth, and provide that, your input to those senior leaders, because they need it, whether they want it, whether they think they do or they don't. They need that information in order to get better. And those are the things that I think translate for me and help kind of uh, help between both the civilian side, law enforcement, and in the military.
Well, I think we've gotten to the point now where it's time for the fun questions
Okay.
because as everyone knows, I create unique and entertaining questions for my guests. So, you were a cop for 30 something years, you worked the beat, you were on the streets for a while. What are some of the best excuses you were given for speeding, DUIs, drugs? Give us some of the good ones.
Like, so for DUI, the one thing that is always, and people ask me this, the common question when I was a young officer and you would pull somebody over for driving, you'd say, "Have you been drinking?" Yes. So, how much have you had to drink?
Three
And
beers.
2 beers, 2 beers. Like, okay, I don't believe you, but 2 beers, okay.
Yeah. And what are some of the good excuses you got when you caught speeders?
Uh, I mean, I think I don't know if I necessarily remember the excuses, but I will tell you that everybody wanted to say, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." And I'm like, well, I don't know if you're necessarily sorry. I mean, I think honestly, you're sorry that you got caught. For me, it was
Yeah.
always about, hey, if somebody would just be honest and say, hey, I wasn't paying attention. I was just going, I was just going too fast. Yeah, I admit, I'm like, half the time, I would probably say, okay, yeah. Depending on the situation, but I'd say, okay, you got to slow down, right? Or, hey, you got to stop for that light.
You got that roll through the stop sign didn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Or inch through that crowded crosswalk. Hey, you got people here. You should wait for that light.
And let me guess, for drugs it was those aren't mine.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I
So
don't know where that came from.
yeah, it just magically appeared in my pocket.
Yeah.
So with your career, both law enforcement and military have a rich heritage of rites of passage as you move yourself through the ranks. What are some family friendly stories that you can share of things that either happened to you or you helped partake in to others?
Um, well, I'd say, in law enforcement, it was really about, I think, for those brand new officers, one of um, the unpleasant piece of law enforcement is that you have to respond to the deceased persons, so
Mm.
somebody died, and 9 times out of ten it's somebody died of, natural causes. They died in their homes, whatever. But for the most part, officers get dispatched to it unless they die like in a nursing home or a hospital. Officers get dispatched to it because they have to confirm that no foul play happened. And so, sometimes you'll get 3 or 4 a day, it's depending on where you work in the neighborhood. And what we would do is we would load up the brand new rookie with those, because most of the senior folks were like, yeah, when I've been there before, I don't want to do that, especially for those ones where somebody has been, deceased for a week or two, it can get pretty ripe, so it's like, hey, send the
Well,
rookie to that one.
let's make it a little bit more lighthearted. Like I know when I was enlisted, our new lieutenants that would come through, sometimes their berets might find their way in the freezer. You know, you got any good stories like that about, because I know you were on SWAT too, so there's got to be some good stories there of good-hearted messing with people.
Oh yeah, yeah. We would, you would hide their, their helmet, or something like that, and let them run around frantically. You wouldn't do that for the senior guys, but you do it for the younger guys until, at the last minute they're like, I don't know where it's at, and then hey, here it is.
Yeah,
You left it over here, rookie.
they're running around looking for it, looking the same place 5 times, and then
Yeah,
it appears they're the 6th.
yeah. But it's
So,
all about building the team, right? So it's a lighthearted fun, but you kind of you bond as a team when those kind of things happen.
yeah, everybody else does except for the one that's the butt of the joke.
Yeah. Well, hopefully you're not the butt of the joke for too long.
Well, that goes back to how do you build a team? How do you how do you present yourself as as a team member and a teammate? Because they say it in the special operations community that once you make it to your unit, to your team, you're trying out every day for your role.
Right.
And I'm sure you had a saying like that on SWAT.
Yeah. Well, it's all about being a good teammate, right? Because everybody has to pull their weight. Most of those um, teams like SWAT or special forces, the Rangers, I mean uh, there's not a whole lot of resources there. So if you don't pull your weight, then you're exposing somebody else to a risk. And that can only happen for so long, especially in those high performing teams. And then they're going to ask you to leave because you're not carrying your weight.
And that even happens on the normal teams too, for lack of a better term, because
Right.
like we talked about before, that there's with law enforcement, there's 2 or 3 people that become the poster child for what not to do, but they overshadow the hundreds of people in that department that are doing the right things 90% of the time. But because 2 or 3 bad apples are the ones getting the press, it negates so much good stuff that goes on. And that's not just in law enforcement, that's everywhere.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think law enforcement, because of the nature of its work, because of the authority, the responsibilities, I think there's a heightened scrutiny as there should be. But you're right. And regardless of the organization, it's all about carrying your weight, being a good teammate.
Yeah, I think it's Pareto's principle that goes back to that 80-20 rule that you spend 80% of your time with 20% of the problem.
Right, right. Well, I mean, that's the common leadership challenge that we all have, as an NCO in the military, you always had that one or two junior enlisted folks that you spent most of your time with, and it took you away from the ability to be able to work with those other members of the team that are pulling their weight, and so you can build, greater skills as across the organization.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place to stop for today. So, Brian, do you have anything you want to share with the audience or where you want them to engage with you or find you on any
Ye-
platforms?
I'm right now I'm kind of semi-retired, but doing some security consultant work on the side, and doing some leadership training on the side. So I'd be happy to engage if somebody is interested in what I can provide their organization or their team. But Trevor asked me to do this, and I jumped on it. I worked for Trevor for several years and always
Well,
enjoyed working Trevor.
I worked for him actually, not he didn't work for me.
We worked together, and I enjoyed working with Trevor, and so when Trevor asked me to come on, I jumped at the chance, because any opportunity to work with Trevor, is a great opportunity for me to spend some more time with a great human and a great American.
And how will and do you want me just to put your LinkedIn page in the show notes for him?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's how you can reach out to Brian if you have any questions or want to talk to him further. So with that, I'm going to say, like I always end the show with, like, subscribe, and follow on our social media platforms. If you got value from the show, please leave a comment, share the episode with a friend. This is something that I'm doing to bring value to everyone around me and also showcase people like Brian. The stories that are out there that they don't make it to the 200,000 followers on LinkedIn or the 50,000 followers that everybody hears about. These are the true heroes. These are the true people that make things great. And they have wealths of knowledge that I don't want to go wasted and untapped. So please like and subscribe, share the episode, share the show. And with that, I'll end as I always do with, for Bryan Grenon, may all your deliverables be on time, your budget's in the black, and your scope not creeping. For Bryan Grenon, I'm still Trevor, and I'm still the disgruntled PM. Thanks for listening.